this exhibition tries to do is sort of map the development of modern art in Nigeria from the period of British indirect rule, so from the early 20th century, really, through to the end of the century, by which time artists have become part of this kind of global Nigerian diaspora, which of course thrives to this very day. So it's a very broad kind of exhibition looking at 59 artists. There are about 300 works in the exhibition, spanning painting, sculpture, ceramics, textile, film, video, poetry, theatre. So it's very all-encompassing and very much a celebration of Nigerian art and culture. It's been about 3 years in development, I would say, but it's kind of lived in, at least in my imagination, for a lot longer, probably since I joined Tate Modern in 2019. So when I arrived at Tate, we had a dedicated committee called the Africa Acquisition Committee, which enables us to acquire work from the continent, from the region. And that committee has kind of led the way in terms of enriching Tate's engagement with African art. But I would say that the collection was largely weighted towards contemporary rather than the modern. When we talk about modern African art, we tend to talk a lot about individual artists rather than movements, because there is so little known about these periods, often because they intersected various socio-political movements, obviously periods of decolonization, but also periods of independence, during which time even some of the most successful artists were never able to build institutional infrastructure that would support their work long term. So you have a situation in Nigeria, for example, where some of the best known artists became better known when they left Nigeria than within their own country. And then you have some exceptions like Ben Nwanwu, who is a British Nigerian artist who kind of straddled the kind of colonial and post-colonial period. So he was actually recognized in the UK. He was awarded an OBE in the 1950s. He was invited to produce a new commissioned bronze sculpture of Queen Elizabeth II, and was really an establishment artist before Nigeria gained independence in 1960. So there are these really fascinating stories about the ways in which artists kind of carved out autonomy and carved out a space for themselves, irrespective of the political climate of the time, or in some cases directly aided by the kind of cultural dynamics that defined the kind of period of British colonial and post-colonial sort of experience in Nigeria. So the exhibition kind of charts that development, but tries to look at the kind of correlation between art and politics during this period. So there's a lot that the show encompasses, but I would say that one of the really significant kind of things that initiated this exhibition was thinking about how do we tell the story of African artists within a kind of a broad history that looks at the experience of making art under colonial rule, not just after the fact. You know what? Anyone that knows Nigerians knows Nigerian people, knows how proud they are, rightly so, of their cultural heritage, and specifically all of the various kind of differences even within Nigeria, whether someone identifies as Hausa, Fulani, Igbo, Yoruba. And it was about identifying all of those different kind of cultural and ethnic identities, but it really being centered around the art. So the only way I know how to tell the story as a museum curator is to try to look at the art and to kind of draw narratives out of the art in order for people to get a fuller understanding. But of course, an exhibition can't cover everything, in fact. So what we try to do is ensure that lots of the kind of key schools and movements are covered. So you have key groups like the Zaria Art Society that formed in the north of the country, and they were actually a multi-ethnic group of artists consisting of artists who were Christian, Muslim, artists that had various cultural and religious affiliations, but who came together to form a post-colonial art around 1957, asking the question, what would be the art of a new nation? So I was often led by the thinking that had already happened during that period, trying to represent it as faithfully as we could, but also having dialogues with various scholars, many of whom are based in Nigeria, but also in the US and the UK, about how best to kind of contextualize these movements. And then some of the work that you do when you're building an exhibition is kind of just trying to find the objects, right? Trying to find the works that can speak to these histories. And we know that with so many specifically Black histories, we don't have enough information. We don't have enough evidence to speak to the kind of important contributions that we've made to art, visual culture, and other aspects of cultural life. So in some cases, it was a bit of forensic work to figure out how one artist might be connected to a certain place or a time period. In other instances, it was just kind of accepting the fact that this is an unfinished story, and there will be rooms that are more complete than others, because in fact, we're telling a story that hasn't really been told in such depth before. So one example I would use is the work of the Nigerian ceramicist Ledi Kwali, who is a Gwari ceramicist, trained at the PTC, at the Pottery Training Center in Abuja, and became associated with the Abuja Ceramics School. Now, many of the artists associated with this particular ceramic school either didn't sign their pots, or they didn't necessarily assign artistic interpretation to their works because they were making utilitarian pots. Now, many years on, we can now recognize these ceramics as some outstanding works of modern art that speak to kind of the technical innovation of Nigerian ceramicists during that period. But because they were so often viewed through the lens of the utilitarian, even looking for a quote by this artist, even looking for something that would demonstrate her intentions was quite difficult. So there is much more research to be done, for instance, on that particular area of how women contributed towards art in Nigeria, even though it's been largely a male-dominated field, partly because of this distinction between art and craft that we see in many societies, but I think very common in African societies, where I would say women are not always acknowledged for their contributions. I would say this is probably the exhibition that I'm most proud of, partly because of the extraordinary effort that's been put into realizing the exhibition. Like, every exhibition has specific challenges, but I think with this particular exhibition, there were moments where we didn't even know that we'd be able to bring works over from Nigeria because of various challenges around export, insurance, trying to ensure that the works were display ready. So if you have a painting, for instance, that's been held in an artist studio for 50, 60 years, the likelihood is that it's not being treated by a conservator. And as such, there may be flaking, or there may be instability, or all of these things that conservators have to check in order for a work to go on view. Actually, furthermore, for a work to leave the country, it has to be kind of, there have to be certain conditions. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for this exhibition. And then kind of added to that, the fact that the majority of the artists in the exhibition are no longer living. So we don't have a full record of, what they might have said about their work or how they wanted their work to be interpreted. So often it's a question of trying to join these dots. But I think that I feel like this exhibition kind of is a constellation, and there's more being added to it all the time. And I want audiences to bring their own cultural perspectives, their own life stories in a way to the exhibition, particularly people with Nigerian heritage, and to feel a sense of pride and purpose in the richness and vitality of everything that the exhibition has to offer. I would say that it's a very intergenerational exhibition. So it spans, like I said earlier, the earliest painting in the exhibition is from around 1922. The reason we didn't include dates is because in the period of British indirect rule, so many of the key historical dates in Nigeria were defined by that colonial relationship. And I didn't necessarily want that to be the anchor for the exhibition. The exhibition is looking at the ways in which artists had found the ways in which artists found complex ways of carving out independence or Pan-African ideologies before the arrival of independence. But it's fundamentally about creating this conversation across generations. So one could step into the exhibition and see a painting like Sisi Nurse by Aina Onabolu, which is one of the earliest figurative paintings by a Nigerian artist. It depicts an important kind of Lagosian philanthropist and businesswoman who was at the time what would have been regarded as part of the Lagos elite. And these were elite Nigerians who were advocating for the sort of decolonization of the education system, but they were also calling for more connections between traditional rulers and the government in order to kind of overturn much of the legislation associated with colonial rule. And many of these elites kind of led the charge in also being philanthropists and supporters for artists. Many of them commissioned some of the earliest portraits that you see in Nigeria. So that's kind of one of the examples of a kind of a very important work that I would want people to pay attention to, that the portrait itself is actually not remarkable. It's the fact that this woman, a Black Nigerian woman, chose to have her portrait taken because she knew that it would be significant, and she knew it was a gesture that would allow her to signify her wealth and her status in 1922. And often we think of Black portrait as a kind of Black portraiture as a kind of contemporaneous practice. It's been going on obviously for hundreds of years, but in Nigeria, that's when it really began to take on a role of its own. And then I would say, in terms of things that I want people to take away from the exhibition, I would say having more dialogues about the intersections of art and kind of culture, the idea that art isn't created in a vacuum. So when you're looking at it, the works of the Osun Osogbo, the artists associated with the worship of Osun Osogbo, the shrine in Osogbo, Nigeria, which is basically a shrine dedicated to Osun, who is the goddess of fertility. You're looking at an artistic practice, but you're also looking at a spiritual practice. And I hope that people find some sense of spiritual, sort of I don't know, kind of I don't want to say sort of, I think that there's something deeply spiritual about the way in which these artists made work that was about more than art, was about ancestral worship, which is about making connection to gods and making connections that kind of challenge the overwhelming presence of Christianity in Nigeria. So there are lots of important cultural conversations that I think have a bearing on today's world in terms of how we think about our identity as being multifaceted as Africans living in a global world. I would just say lastly, yeah, please bring your friends and family to see the exhibition. It's an exhibition that was really made to be enjoyed through discussion and through exchange. We'll have some public programs. So we've got a talk with Yinka Shinabare and Ben Okri, Sir Ben Okri, on the 9th of October. We've got a Tate Late on the 31st of October, which is going to be a celebration of Nigerian youth culture. So you'll hear some music. We've got some amazing performances, DJs and live events. And then there'll be a series of events drawing connections between art and music in our corner cafe, which is actually open after 6 p.m. when the museum opens. I think we've got 4 live events coming up, so have a look at the Tate website to follow that. But when we open on the week of the 7th, I think by the 9th of October, or by the 8th of October rather, we'll be open so for people to enjoy and explore the exhibition. So please come and enjoy it.